Yeah, well, thanks for being here today. And our topic is going to be really looking at the kind of moral issues around this whole question of future human genetic enhancement. And as I go through these issues, I'll actually be drawing from both of the books I've written that Phil was mentioning. And I'll start off just with a little bit of a sort of broad level view of the most recent book that just got published recently, as Phil mentioned, The Patterning Instinct, which is this cultural history of humanity's search for meaning. But as we go into this topic in more detail, we're going to end up actually covering a lot more of the territory that I kind of touched on in this book I wrote about 8 years ago or so, Requiem of the Human Soul, which is a science fiction novel set in the late 22nd century. And as we get into this topic, you'll see why this novel and some elements of it become really helpful to kind of explore what we're going to be looking at. So the question of like sort of moral issues around human genetic enhancement, I'm actually going to be touching on using kind of two lenses, if you will. And they're both concepts that you may not have heard of before. One is a scientific concept called shifting baseline syndrome. And in fact, if anyone wants to put their hands up, if you've actually heard that phrase, shifting baseline syndrome, yeah, it's kind of a new one from most people. And the other concept is one that I touch on in the patterning instinct in the last chapter when I look at potential trajectories to our future, and it's called TechnoSplit. And I'll explain both of these concepts and how they relate to each other as we go into this right now. And so we'll start off just from this kind of big view of what my most recent book, The Patterning Instinct, is about. It looks fundamentally at how culture in different cultures in the world create their own set of values as they draw meaning from the universe. That leads to a set of values that they live, that society feels are the norms that they live according to. And it kind of traces all the way from hunter-gatherer times to the present day how the values that different societies live by affect the course of history. So, as Phil mentioned, it goes from hunter-gatherer times to earlier agrarian civilizations. And then from there, it looks at some of the big splits in history where Western thought developed in one way, leading to our present civilization. And it also looks at a parallel history, if you will, of East Asian thought, traditional Chinese thought, which led to a very different way of understanding the world. And in my view, leads to a lot that we can learn from as we try to find a more sustainable path for our future. But as the book goes through history, it comes to the present era, and the penultimate chapter of the book is called Consuming the Earth in the Modern Era, which is essentially what our society is doing right now, as I think we're all fairly aware of that. And then the final chapter looks at trajectories to our future. And it uses a kind of a systems way of trying to understand the possible trajectories to our future. And one of the fundamental concepts that we start off with is this realization that nothing is preordained about where our future is headed. It's not like some inevitable path. And in fact, each of us, through the ways in which we choose meaning in our lives, even though it might seem like, how's one person going to affect, the future of 7.5 billion people on this earth and these massive forces at play. But each of us actually, through connecting in our own networks of meaning, and through those networks with other networks of meaning, actually has a part to play in where humanity's future is going to take us. And that's why it's not like a spectator sport. It's not like we're looking at something, what's going to happen out there. It's something that we're all involved in what we do, which is why questions about morality, moral choices, get to be not just some sort of interesting philosophical idea or theoretical idea. It's actually something that we are engaged in. And we have a responsibility, really, to understand some of the implications of smaller choices that can become larger ones. So that's where we're going to go in this discussion. And as we look in this final chapter of this book, these trajectories to our future, we find there's actually 3 trajectories that I explore in some detail. One of them is a pretty terrifying one, which is basically the collapse of our civilization. Just looking at the completely unsustainable way in which we are consuming the earth at the present moment, and just recognizing how if that continues to accelerate the way it does, it is right now, we have to really seriously look at our whole entire global civilization at the risk of it collapsing. There's another, at the other extreme, there's another scenario I look at, which is how if we change the values in which we are driven to live our life from this kind of consuming orientation to focusing more on our connection with each other, with the rest of the world, focusing on the quality of our lives, we do have the potential to shift our global society towards what I call like a great transformation in values. Something that can lead to a more sustainable path to future flourishing that can result from deep shifts in the underlying way in which we take meaning from our lives, which are there for most of us, things that just relate to our normal human existence. So those are 2 kind of extremes, if you will. But it's the third scenario that I want to focus attention on today as we explore this issue. And it's a scenario that I call TechnoSplit. And that's a scenario that really, if we can avoid collapse, but without a fundamental change in our values, it's a kind of like, almost like a straight line version of where we're headed for right now if our society keeps doing what it's doing and it's able to sustain itself for a few generations to come. So what TechnoSplit looks at is it starts off by looking at the massive inequalities that we all know are currently existing and getting worse in our world right now. These crazy economic inequalities where a recent Oxfam report talks about how just the wealthiest 8 men in this world own as much wealth as the entire lower half of the human population. 3.5 billion people. Just unbelievable extremes in wealth, which are only getting worse every single year. But as we are looking at the development of the potential for genetic enhancement, what TechnoSplit looks at is the scenario that these incredible inequities in wealth and economics move into a realm of inequities in not just technology, but actual human genetics, and the way in which humans can have the potential to evolve themselves. So that before too long, we might actually find ourselves split into 2 separate species. One kind of species may be barricaded from the rest of the world as it's enduring a sort of a climate change-driven collapse that's kind of enjoying its technological enhancements and amazing forms of connectivity and new ways of really defining what it is to be human, while the rest of humanity is stuck in what is essentially a collapse, but a collapse for the majority rather than all of the human race. So those are the scenarios I look at in the book. And if we focus on TechnoSplit, we can try to get a better understanding of where that comes from and why you could be headed in that direction. Well, it doesn't take for me to tell you that, of course, technology is changing at an ever-increasing pace. We're all very aware of that. And probably most people here coming with a scientific interest are aware of this notion of exponential growth, where it's not just like a straight line growth, but the rates can be a certain amount, but when it's exponential, the actual shift as a percent from one stage to the next gets to be larger and larger. So it's essentially with exponential growth, if you have something doubling each period, then essentially every period that it doubles, it can be as great as all of the changes that have happened from the beginning of history to that time. And that's the kind of growth that we are looking at in things like human population, resource consumption, and with technology, we're looking at an even faster than exponential growth. It's because we're looking at, say, exponential growth, say, in the power of computing. You're probably familiar with Moore's law, which looks at the rate in which microprocessors get smaller and smaller, and it's been true now for decades. But then Moore's law gets to attach to, for example, a greater understanding of genetics. So then you get a double kind of exponential where you can apply one set of technologies to another, and the changes are just dramatic. So when as you're probably aware, the Human Genome Project was this plan to map out the human genome. And when they first started to plan it, there was this idea of maybe we can do it within 10 years, and then people were going, well, it might take far longer than that. And it got done way faster than people even dreamed was possible because of this kind of combination of the technological advances in data manipulation and the greater understanding of genetics. So, in my book, I look at the possibilities of different kinds of actual singularities. And you may know the work of somebody like Raymond Kurzweil, who he's actually written the book, The Singularity is Near, and he looks at this notion of a singularity where humans may one day be able to upload their information to something great, the great server in the sky, if you will, and then they'll become immortal because then your body can die, you can just download information, create a new body, whatever. Now, I don't believe that that is a feasible scenario because I think fundamentally it's based on this dualistic split, this notion of mind and body being two separate entities, and this simple mapping out of a sort of machine metaphor that basically the body is like a hardware and software is like the mind, so you can just upload one and download it to a new body. I actually think that it is based on a flawed presumption. It's not likely to happen. In fact, I don't think it could happen. There's another kind of concept of singularity, which is this notion of machine intelligence becoming self-aware and potentially terrifying consequences. A lot of very, very smart scientists are quite concerned about that. And I do think that's a serious issue that we need to look at. There's even another potential singularity of humans actually developing neural interfaces where we can connect with each other through the internet, so we can essentially almost like become one human superorganism, which is a really interesting concept, very terrifying in some ways, and also quite exciting in other ways. This notion, imagine if we could all touch into each other's feelings, so that we're not just using words to connect symbolic ideas, but actually to connect in deeper ways. So those are some possibilities. But where we're going to go now for the rest of this talk is to look at more of an incremental approach. So recognizing that some singularity may take place in our future, let's, for this talk, just put that aside and look at the possibility of incremental, fast, but incremental enhancements in humans' abilities to actually genetically improve ourselves. So with that in mind, I'm going to shift the topic right now to look at this other notion I raised up front that I call shifting baseline syndrome. So, probably got a little bit of a feeling just from those words what that might be talking about. But this actual phrase is something that was first coined by somebody called Daniel Pauly, who's actually a fisheries expert. And he wrote a paper in a great journal called Trends in Ecology and Evolution, which has a lovely acronym TREE, which I think. In this, about 20 or so years ago, I think 1995, he wrote a short article about how he noticed that people in fisheries areas, and he was focusing a lot in the Newfoundland area, which has been a source of serious decline in fish size, that people, each new generation of fishermen who come along have a sense of a baseline of this is what the size of a fish should look like. And then as years go on, they go, okay, they're declining a little bit, but we'll work on that and no worries. But then when you look back in early history and you actually look at the size of the fish in that same area a few generations ago, you find that the biggest fish now was considered a relative minnow that people might just throw back into the ocean some generations earlier. But the baseline that people used to measure what was the norm had changed one generation to the next. So the sense of what was a norm in one generation is completely, almost fundamentally different from what was a norm some generations earlier. So this is a powerful concept, and it applies in a lot of very important ways around in different areas. And one area I think is so powerful to recognize, and I touch on it in the book, when we look at this notion of the possibility of collapse of human civilization, one of the examples that people like to look at is what happened on Easter Island. Some of you may know that Easter Island was an island that was populated hundreds of years ago by Polynesians. And when it was first inhabited, it was a lovely, beautiful tropical paradise with trees, mammals, just a great place to kind of put down roots, raise a family, and have a lovely life. But when I think Captain Cook discovered the Easter Islanders back in a couple hundred years ago, what he discovered was this absolutely horrendous nightmare scenario. He found an island where there were no trees, absolutely zero tree on the island, very few crops. Because of the lack of trees, the people who still scrabbled a living there had virtually no infrastructure. They lived in caves. They were basically like half-starved, and anything about their culture or civilization had virtually collapsed. They were like worse. I mean, we can say like living in the Stone Age, but actually, people who lived in the so-called Stone Age were quite healthy and happy for the most part. These people, it's the nightmare existence. And as anthropologists looked at the story of Easter Island, one of the things they saw was this overutilization of resources. And Jared Diamond wrote this great book called Collapse some years ago, when he studied Easter Island quite closely. And he asked this question, what was that Easter Islander thinking of? The one who cut down the last tree. This deep existential question, how could they have done this? But then, when we take this notion of shifting baseline syndrome, I actually pose this notion in this last chapter of my book that, maybe when that Easter Islander cut down that last tree, he actually wasn't thinking about anything, because that last tree wouldn't have even been a tree. It would have been some little stalk that would have been viewed as virtually useless, as some little thing that somebody might want to use as a cane to walk on or something like that. Because of shifting baseline syndrome, as the way that those trees disappeared, it wouldn't have been there were these great trees, and then there was this one final great tree that people hacked down and said, okay, that's the last one. Over generations, they would have cut down the trees earlier and earlier, and the very notion of what a tree could be would have been lost to the culture. And finally, the last tree being cut would have been a non-event. It was just another piece of vegetation that had no meaning to it. So that's a notion of shifting baseline syndrome. And it also can work in technology. We've talked about how technology moves faster and faster. And of course it works with us with things like internet speed. Like probably most of us here can remember clearly when we were first amazed by the notion of the internet, and you'd dial up with America Online and you'd hear that sound, and it would be almost like magic that a picture would start appearing on your computer screen or whatever. And of course now, without Wi-Fi, we might get annoyed if we have to wait for a couple of seconds on our not just our computer screen, but even on our smartphone for the picture, for the video to come shortly. So that's a perfect example, again, of shifting baseline syndrome moving in another direction. But shifting baseline syndrome also works for social norms. Now, that can be a great positive, and because there's a lot of ways in which social norms have shifted and that baseline syndrome has improved dramatically over generations. So now, of course, we all recognize slavery is an absolute unmitigated evil. And of course, there's still slavery taking place in the world, but it's very hush-hush, and people who are engaged in that know they better be quiet about it. It's an outlawed, it's an international crime. Now, just a couple of hundred years ago, of course, wars were fought. It was a brand new notion that slavery could even be something that was actually wrong or should be outlawed. So that's a dramatic example of that. But we see that all over the place. Things like animal cruelty. The things that we take as norms now are very different from horrendous cruelty that took place in any culture we look at historically in terms of that. And in just more recently, same-sex marriage is another wonderful example of shifting baseline syndrome, where people who didn't even think they could be legally married to another partner in their lifetime can now be married in most places, in at least many advanced societies in the world right now. But it can also, social mores can also move in the other direction. So the destruction of the environment is something where things that we're beginning to take for granted now would have been just totally outrageous just a few decades ago. And now as we look at climate change, something I get concerned about is concepts of geoengineering get to be talked about more and more in scientific journals as something, at the moment it's like, well, we know it's a bad thing, we don't want to do it, but we have to be prepared to do some initial testing so at least we can be prepared if we need to. And I'm quite convinced that 10 to 20 years from now, that will be subject to shifting baseline syndrome, and suddenly geoengineering will be like, well, this was tested this way, we should do larger tests than that, we should, I think we need to be aware of that too. So, how does shifting baseline syndrome work when we look at the possibilities of human genetic engineering? Well, again, we see this happening already. It was just 20 years ago that Dolly the sheep was cloned, and this is like news around the world having this happen. Now, actually, there's a Chinese company called Beijing Genomics Institute, which actually has a cloning factory. And they're probably cloning like 500 genetically engineered cloned pigs a year, and planning on sort of bringing that to industrial scale. And then if we apply that to humans, there's a proven technique called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which allows parents who might have high risk for passing on a genetic disease to their offspring to actually look at potential embryos in the Petri dish and do a diagnosis to identify which ones do or don't have a propensity for that genetic disease. Obviously, I can't imagine how anybody could argue, find a moral argument against that. It's such a humane, wonderful application of technology. But, of course, that same evaluation can be used to also determine if those offspring are going to have, say, blue eyes or brown eyes, or the sex. Are they going to be male or female? So it's very easy to see how that can be used in ways that seem kind of benign at the time for going beyond just avoiding a particular kind of disease. And in fact, that same Chinese company, Beijing Genomics Institute, had actually begun mapping the genes of high IQ subjects as a potential, to essentially develop a database that could be used in just this kind of way. And probably everyone here is familiar with these recent developments of CRISPR technology, which allows far more efficiency and flexibility and precision to actually edit genes, and so that the likelihood of creating what you want is far easier. So currently, there are some clear moral arguments against this notion of creating designer humans. Francis Fukuyama, many people have heard of as a historian, social critic, and he's called transhumanism, this notion of developing an improved human being, in his words, the world's most dangerous idea, claiming that what's ultimately at stake is the very grounding of the human moral sense, which has been a constant ever since there were human beings. Well, it's kind of a question about actually what is a constant about a human moral sense. I would argue that some things are a constant, actually, and some things have changed quite dramatically, especially since the rise of agrarian civilizations, for example, and in modern times too. But that gives you a sense. And there's another prominent bioethicist, in fact, a whole group led by somebody called George Annas, who's highly respected. He's a lawyer who's gone so far as to propose legislation to make this notion of inheritable genetic modification actually a crime against humanity. And he argues that the reason for this is that this would lead to basically the development of a new group of what he calls post-humans, who would then want to essentially make our race extinct, if you will, leading to genocide. And so that's his rationale for that. So those are some pretty strong positions. But these are positions put out by mainstream, real leading serious thinkers about these issues. So that's where we stand now. And now, where I want to sort of take us from here to the rest of this talk is this kind of exploration of what happens then when we apply this notion of shifting baseline syndrome to the potential for human genetic enhancements. And that's where my science fiction novel that I wrote some years ago comes into play in this. Just to give you a real quick sense of what the novel's about, and it's set in the late 22nd century. And most of the humans in the world are genetically enhanced, pretty much just like George Annas was concerned about. And there are, however, some what are called primals who have not become enhanced, who are just like us, basically. Normal biological, what we consider normal biological humans. But these people in the late 22nd century are really the world's underclass. Like right now, if we look at the world right now, there'd be the kinds of people who are just scraping by on just a few dollars a day, of which, of course, we know there are only too many, 1 or 2 billion people like that in the world around. But also people who may be living in the developed world, but living on the margins of society, forced to live in ghettos and lacking access to basic financial and health infrastructure that we know is such a moral crime in today's world. But in this future world, these are who the primals are. And the people who are dehumans, or designer humans, they consider themselves to be pretty advanced. And they're actually not nearly as aggressive. They actually kind of ironed out some of the aggressive genes or gene sets out of the human genome. And they're not so stuck on fundamentalist ideas. And just as we might have a sense of what is a kind of a liberal sort of ideal for how a society might be right, or how our society is right now, maybe segments of our society that we think have good values. These people in the late 22nd century think that they are that ideal. They're thoughtful, they're humane, there's no war, and health is a completely transformed thing. People live for a couple of 100 years, no problem. They have virtual reality. They can explore the world without destroying it and consuming it in the way that our civilization's doing. And so they're having this hearing at the United Nations where some group of them have decided, you know, these primals, they're dangerous, they're dirty, they live these polluted lives, they're uneducated. The best thing we can do is make them extinct. But because these dehumans are so advanced, they're not going to do some genocide like Jordanus is worried about, or at least it's a different kind. They're going to put out this radioactive isotope that only works with these unenhanced humans, that allows them to only have one child per couple, so that over the generation they would just fade away. So there's no blood and guts, no murders, just a sort of a very humane fading away of this kind of rather bad kind of historical past that these designer humans came from. So that's the kind of setup of the book. And actually, what the book's about is some primal rights activists who essentially kidnap a primal who's a historian from a small community in the US, and they bring him to the United Nations, and they try to get him to talk about his own humanity as a kind of a primal representative, to kind of argue to allow humans to stay around. And ultimately, the only argument they have, because these dehumans are so advanced, is that there's something, a human soul. There's something in the human soul that got lost as these genetically enhanced humans got to be better and better and better. And to allow these primals to become extinct would be to lose this human soul, which is why it's called Requiem of the Human Soul. And the book's kind of an exciting, there's all kinds of thrilling kind of stuff that happens in the story. But, of course, I won't go there, I don't want to spoil it. But what I do throughout the book is I offer, I offer 4 what I call future articles, kind of interspersed through the book, that look at how we can get from where we are right now in our current world to this late 22nd century scenario, which all of us right now feel, what a horrendous future. And yet, with this notion of shifting baseline syndrome, every step of the way would seem very reasonable. So what I'm going to do is I'll just take you through these, just kind of at a high level, these 4 different articles that take place interspersed through the next 100, 150 years or so. And then I'd like to open this up for discussion. And I'd like to begin, and so I'll ask you to think about this as I describe these articles. At which points would you, with your current set of moral beliefs, would you draw the line? Where is that place where we sort of go beyond something that is just wrong, something we can't have? And how can we expand that analysis? Or is there a place where you draw the line? And how can we expand that to forming maybe a more thoughtful sense of a moral approach to genetic enhancement than some of those people I was quoting earlier, like the Fukuyama says, there's just this moral certitude, we can't do anything about it. Is there some way we can get a kind of a deeper sense of how to think about these issues? So that's what I'll ask you to think about as I just give you this summary of these 4 articles. Okay, well, and I have them here, like printed out each one. So this first one, it's an article in the New York Journal on September 29th, 2044. So what is that? It's about 27 years from now, I guess, something like that. And the title is called Matterhorn Insurance Plays Genetic Favorites. And the subtitle is Announcement Adds Fuel to Simmering Controversy. So in this article, what has happened is an insurance company has announced that from now on, it's going to offer significant premium benefits for people whose children have arisen from this same kind of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis that I was just describing before that already exists in a simple kind of form right now in our society. So in this world of 2044, it's possible for humans, if they choose, to just for a couple to put their zygotes in these kind of petri dishes, and for a whole analysis to be able to be done on all of the different possible permutations of what might come from this couple. And it's possible to find one where virtually all of the genetic propensities for disease can be excluded. So a far, far healthier child can arise from this approach. So in this world of 2044, the article goes on to talk about how in Europe, this actually become policy. There's this kind of Europe-wide national health service, essentially. And so it's a free access to anybody who's a European citizen to do this. And it's become policy that this availability for parents to offer this kind of approach for enhanced offspring should be made freely available to any parents going forward. And there's this whole table of the reduction in incidence and reduction in mortality from various diseases that have been discovered. Yes, things like Alzheimer's, Lou Gehrig's disease, breast cancer, cystic fibrosis, the list goes on. And of course, not everything, genes are not destiny, but even things like obesity and some things which arise a lot from lifestyle also can have genetic predispositions. So in this case, very simple. But of course, in the United States, with this market-driven economy, that wasn't even thought about. But this insurance company is using the market approach instead to say, we're going to offer such better premiums for people who, and not just in terms of life insurance, but in terms of medical insurance. So of course parents are going to say, well, for my kids, I don't want them to lose access to medical insurance as they get older, so I want my kid to be one of these prenatally optimized ones, so they'll get access to good health insurance in their future. So that's what that article was about. That's 2044. So now let's move forward another generation, shifting baseline syndrome to 2069. And this is an article in a magazine called Wealth Monthly. And it's called The New Offshore Baby Boom. And the subtitle of this article is The Rush for Designer Babies Brings a New Line of Business to the Offshore Banking Centers. So in this world, what simply happens is from that initial prenatal optimization, businesses got to develop these abilities to actually figure out that certain sets of genes could allow kids to grow up, smarter or more beautiful or healthier, or all kinds of things that parents want their children to be. And so actually the article goes to talk about how this business developed in the United States in the 2050s. But it actually came across some roadblocks. First, there was this Christian fundamentalism against it. But then that seemed to kind of fade because they realized that the abortion rate went down when this kind of approach was taken. So that got to be less an issue. But of course, the real issue was lawsuits. So what would happen is a company would offer this designer optimization to a family. It got it got paid handsomely, maybe a couple $1 million at that point in time, and then the kid didn't turn out quite like the parents expected. So imagine these massive lawsuits, and it wasn't going to happen. So what these companies discovered is that they could set up these clinics in the Caribbean, in what are now the sort of offshore banking centers, where they could essentially make sure the laws were designed in these islands to not allow these kind of lawsuits. And then American wealthy or affluent Americans could just fly over there, go through this whole process, and create their own designer betas. And then the article talks just about how it all gets done, and how it's not just a matter of designing which kinds of gene sets they want, but what has happened by that point is certain celebrities have cashed in on their fame to basically have their own gene sets be marketed, be patented and marketed, so that the number one footballer at that time gets to, everybody wants a Halliburton physical prowess. And then there's a film star, Kelly Hendrick, who's considered the most beautiful embodiment of female beauty at that time. She's actually she has the number one DNA panel. And so, in fact, this article lists the top 10 owners of the top best celebrity DNA panels, which you have film stars, real estate developers who are selling their genetic enhancement set for personality and intelligence, and then you've got basically mostly personality, intelligence, beauty, physique. Those are the things that really matter to these parents of 2069. So that's the next article. Now let's move forward a little bit. And 22 years later, it's 2091. And the world's got a lot grimmer at that point. There's these big power blocks of China and the Western world fighting each other for dominance in the future of this world. And in fact, the world is about to enter what are called the Great Global War. So there's this real kind of dark feeling approaching at that point in time. And this next article is actually in Foreign Affairs in September 21. And it's written by somebody called Dr. Henry Woolwright. And it's called Defending America's Homeland, the Genetic Solution. And the subtitle is the author, who has served in 2 Homeland Party administrations as National Security Advisor, presents his case for incorporating required genetic modification, or RGM, as part of the set of proposed constitutional changes in the upcoming Homeland Security Bill of Rights. And this kind of dark time, the gist of the article is the writer looks at how China is preparing for wars on these multiple fronts, and how China has, for years now, been applying their version of required genetic modification, which is that every time somebody does one of these genetic panels that we just looked at 20 years earlier, they require certain bare minimums in this genetic panel, such as that the person needs to be more aggressive, more doctrinaire, more intelligent, and have faster response times. So they're building this set of millions of warriors for this new war that is expected to be happening out there. And of course, this person is arguing, we in the United States have to stop, all these people who are wasting their money on these celebrity panels. We need to have a required genetic modification too, so that we get our warriors to fight this battle that takes place. So that's this kind of dark article. And then the world goes through a period of what are known as the Great Global Wars. Just the absolute worst time in all of human history, which makes the First and Second World War pale in comparison. There are local nuclear holocausts going on in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, different parts of the world. There are just tens, hundreds of millions of people who starve to death. It's just almost catastrophe, but not quite. Civilization makes it through. And then the final article I want to take you through is in Harper Atlantic magazine in February 2117. And it's a speech fragment and it's entitled Phoenix Rising. And this is like a new hopeful world. We can imagine, we can
look historically at what the world was like in the late 1940s and early 1950s after the Second World War, the sense of hope, the sense of the United Nations, new rights, universal human rights, a sense of the possibility of what we can build out of the ashes, this whole notion of never again after the Holocaust. So imagine a similar kind, but even more extreme version of that. And this was a speech given by Juan Jose Gonzalez, the newly appointed chairman of the United Nations Governing Council. And he, in his speech, he talks about how, after all this happened, we've got to say never again. And how do we actually do this? We look back in history, people say never again, and it gets bad all over again. And there's, what he argues for is something called the Global Aggression Limitation Treaty, or GALT for short. And what this treaty does is it goes beyond like the kinds of treaties we've always known in the past. It's a treaty where everyone agrees that any genetic human modification that takes place for new generations has to subordinate gene sets that have been identified that leads to heightened aggression or doctrinaire beliefs in humans. And they've done enough studies at this point in time to recognize that if you can subordinate, not get rid of, but subordinate those gene sets and how they're expressed, then what happens is the vast majority of humans just get to be more reasonable. And they get to be more empathic, more compassionate, and they sound so great, doesn't it? I mean, and this is what they're saying, like this is the possibility. This way, the UN, Juan Jose Gonzalez is saying, this way we can truly, when we say never again, we truly mean it, because we're going to develop a new, improved human that won't do all these horrendous things that we've done in the past. But he says, there is this one problem. As you look around the world, there are a couple of billion of these primals, these people who have never been enhanced. And then, so what do we do with them? And so he says, well, the first thing we need to do is we need to set up a humane commission, a UN authority for the primal species called UNAPS. And we need to start to work out how we, a lot of these people are resistant to the idea of any kind of genetic engineering, and they've got very different cultural norms. We need to figure out how to manage them humanely in this future. So this is the early 22nd century. And then it's a few generations later in the late 22nd century where the same UNAPS, the same commission, basically, is the one that's determined, it would really be wise if we just kind of did this very humane extinction of these poor primals that are left behind. So that's the background. So this is this notion of shifting baseline syndrome. And I did talk a little longer than I planned, I'm afraid, but I did want to, with the time we have left, I'd love to just kind of open it up and get any questions or thoughts from you about where you would draw the line or what else arose from.
I'm going to mention 3 genetic engineerings that are being done today, and after I've described them, I'm going to ask you if you don't feel they have been beneficially used. Young couples of Jewish extraction can go be tested for Tay-Sachs disease.
Yes.
Black couples can go be tested for sickle cell anemia.
Right.
Sickle cell anemia,
Right.
I'm sorry. Older women becoming pregnant can go be tested for mongoloidism, and then in each case make the decisions. Hasn't that been used so far beneficially?
Absolutely. I'm a total proponent of that. I think in every case, what's been done is just one of the great miracles of modern medicine. I support it unequivocally. And that's the very thing I'm talking about. That as we look at these things, every step of the way, this is not, the gist around my talks are not to say that, we've got to realize how bad
genetic enhancement is right now because look at what can happen. It's to realize that how every step of the way, and what seems like an incrementally absolute right decision, and it seems like right to me, as I stand here right now, but how that can lead to what, when we look at the big picture, feels like a complete breach of norms.
There's a state that has just proposed a law saying that if you do testing for Down syndrome, you cannot abort that baby. So there is already a pushback on something that I was facing genetic testing for hemophilia for a child and had to face that decision. What if it came forward? How would I deal with it? So this is a current issue, and now fundamentalists, I believe it's Ohio, are saying, no, wait a minute, God has created this baby, how dare you interfere?
Exactly, yes. And we just, of course, that's all part of the wider context of these cultural wars that are dividing our country so terribly right now.
Well, there are all of these embryos that were created in the test tube or in the petri dish, and some were chosen to be implanted. And I guess there's freezers full of these ones that were not implanted, and nobody knows what to do with them.
Yeah, well, that's a tough one.
Yes, I mean, there are so many moral issues that arise from these
Well,
things because of the fact, of course, that we're dealing with realities that humans haven't ever dealt with before. So how could that not be?
The problem we're facing now is who makes these decisions. Right now we have people making decisions for us that we don't agree with. The people backing the politicians who are in office.
I think that is so true.
Kind of
and I think
split
that,
has happened.
you know, I think you've hit maybe the most important point about this whole thing, that when we talk about we as humans, there is no we actually.
Right.
There's all kinds of we's and all kinds of different power blocks. And oftentimes, yes, I think in those articles I was looking at, what we see is decisions get made, you know, in Europe they might be getting made by more, some sort of welfare state kind of mentality. In the US by commercial drivers. Then later on in the century they get made by military forces and military powers. And so I think the question is of who we are and who gets to have the power to make those decisions is crucial.
Have you seen that movie Gattaca, the famous?
Absolutely, yes.
Depicts examples of, you know, where you get to decide whether you like that six-fingered,
Right.
12-fingered pianist and all that.
Exactly.
But also I'm a big fan of Gibson, the sci-fi writer William Gibson, who's done futurist ideas, like people farther in the future have experienced something they call a jackpot, which about 2/3 of the human race has gotten wiped out by environmental and other issues. And they're surviving in a bubble, almost literally,
Yeah.
and they're able to go back to sort of a past that sort of their past, but once they get there, it's no longer their past. And they finally can, by information transfer, affect the past and improve situation. You know,
Oh, interesting, yeah.
It's mind games, but he deals with the questions of perfect humans all the time. Somebody just wants to be the latest movie star, so they have themselves made to look like that genetically.
Right. And
he has a fun.
yeah, I know, it's fun. And, you know, the thing is, right now, you know, we probably, most people in this room, maybe everyone, you know, we have this kind of, that sense of this moral antagonism to that. You know, the idea, I mean, right now, if there were a couple of parents who were in some focus group and said, yeah, I want my baby, I'd love to design my baby to be just this and that, we'd all go, it doesn't feel right, you know? And yet, what do we do when many people who have the affluence to be able to pay money to make sure their kids, you know, go to the best schools, and you know, if they're having trouble in some particular area, they get the tutors to really do better than that, so that they can get to the best Ivy League or other top colleges. So they can. I mean, what is going on right now is essentially parents throughout the developed world, parents who can afford it, doing everything they can to essentially create their optimal sort of experience for their offspring. And we don't think that's wrong. I mean, we might think there are wrong inequities about the fact that some of those people can afford to do that others can't. But we don't think there's something morally wrong about a parent trying to do the best for their offspring. So these are big questions.
Well, we've kind of had to face that concept, I think, being talked about, say, forced sterilization. Like the person who wants to push forced sterilization would say, well, we need a better gene pool for the future, so let's eliminate that person's ability to reproduce. And I think a lot of people would say, well, that's a repugnant idea. And it's kind of what you're saying about these other steps in the future, that somehow there'll be do-gooders amongst us who will raise us all up by doing some tricky little thing.
Right. Yeah, I know, that's another issue. And in the book, I kept the moral gray, really in a way that this novel I wrote was about exploring gray areas, about avoiding blacks or whites. And so we all recognize that some sort of genocidal sterilization, at least, you know, those of us who share the norms, I'm sure we all do here, it's just wrong, plain wrong. But in this case, what it was that only people, these changes in policy were when people chose to genetically enhance their offspring, there were certain requirements that went along with it. So it wasn't that everyone had to be a certain way, but it was almost like you've got to sort of pay to play. You know, if you want your offspring to be enhanced, they need to be good Americans or whatever, so that they have to have good qualities in order to save the country against the enemy or whatever. So that's the idea about these kind of moral gray areas there. Yeah, I'm sorry.